You're listening to Voices of Customer Experience. I'm your host, Mary Drumond, and on this podcast, we shine the spotlight on individuals who are making a difference in customer experience. We also proudly bring you the very best of customer experience, behavior economics, data analytics, and design. Make sure to subscribe or follow us on social for updates. Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix. Discover your worth at worthix.com. Dr. Namratha Vedire, or Nami, is the Associate Director of the Center for Deliberate Innovation at Georgia Tech. At the center, Nami works closely with the leaders in educational innovation, founders of startups, and heads of innovation teams at large corporations. The deliberate innovation approach educates entrepreneurs and innovators to actively recognize the common cognitive biases and blind spots that so often result in startup failure and corporate innovation non-success. Nami holds a Ph.D. in electrical engineering from Yale University. From Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Namratha Vedire.
Hi, James. Hi, Mary. It's really great to talk to both of you guys. Thank you for having me today.
Great to be here, Mary.
Thanks for coming on. We're fascinated by your career and by everything that you've done and you're doing. For our listeners who are not familiar with your work, can you introduce yourself, talk about your background, your education, and what you're doing at the moment?
Sure. So my name is Nami, and I am the Associate Director for the Center for Deliberate Innovation at Georgia Tech. Before my tenure here at Georgia Tech, I was at Yale. I was finishing up my PhD in electrical engineering. And before that, I did my undergrad in India from the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad, in electrical engineering as well. So as far as my background and experiences go, as you can see, I'm classically trained as an engineer. And I really enjoy that side of my brain that thinks logically and thinks in a systematic way. But thanks to my parents who put me in a community art center when I was young, I also had the great experience and thrill of developing this design and art side to me as well from a very young age. And so I went to Yale to do my PhD in electrical engineering, which Yale's program is so flexible. It was great to be able to experience that. I took courses at the School of Art. And in the process of that, I wanted to get some hands-on experience. So I took a few part-time jobs. And one of the jobs that I took was to be a marketing intern for the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute. While I was there, I developed a very good relationship with James Boyle, who is the managing director for the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute. And in that internship, I found that I had a knack for visual storytelling, and it really interested me. So I went down this path of combining sort of the visual aspects and the design aspects of what I enjoy doing, but learning how to put together a story and how do you convey pitches for the startups in a very concise way that compels the audience and that moves them to action. So that was where I found this very interesting mix of design, engineering, and business, and found myself drawn to the sphere of innovation and startups. And that's kind of where I am right now. Once I finish my program, I was looking for opportunities in that space of innovation and entrepreneurship. And that's how I reached out to Dr. Merrick First, who's the director for the Center for Deliberate Innovation. And I'm the associate director now a year later.
Awesome. One of the interesting things you mentioned, when I first saw it in your bio, I was really intrigued around deliberate innovation. So I sort of thought, well, is there innovation that's not deliberate, that just happens by accident? So could you tell the listeners a little bit about what deliberate innovation is about?
Sure. The way the center thinks about innovation is the human beings, entrepreneurs, innovators, at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And when we go out and do innovation or work on innovative projects, the instrument through which we do this work is ourselves. And as we all know, the human mind and the human body have some limitations. So shouldn't you be interested in the limitations and, knowing the faults of the instrument through which you're conducting the innovation work? And that's sort of the ethos and thinking around deliberate innovation. And let me just elaborate a little bit on what I mean by these constraints or limitations that I was talking about. So we all know that we're limited by cognitive biases, that human beings are subject to illusions and blind spots. And despite that, we're living full and rich lives. But in the context of innovation, the flaws that these illusions and biases expose just leave us open to so many mistakes and faults that can kill those innovation projects and startups very quickly. And that's why at the center, the whole focus is how can we bring these sort of like psychological and social and developmental limitations or constraints that we have to the forefront, so innovators and entrepreneurs can not only be aware of it, but then learn how to build processes around them so that they don't have to their startups don't get killed because of the effects of these phenomenon. And that's the whole ethos behind the deliberate innovation approach.
That is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. And is there also a portion that focuses on the obstacles that startups face when trying to sell to big corporations and big enterprises, like the not only the obstacles, but maybe the roadblocks or the politics, or I don't know, the different interdepartmental problems or silos that you also help startups navigate around?
It's interesting you bring up corporations and startup selling to corporations. So the way the center has worked is one of the programs is the Flashpointed GT programs that the center runs. And in that program, in the last 8 cohorts, we've had not only startups go through the program, but also innovation teams from corporations like NCR, Coca-Cola, and Mercedes-Benz, who work alongside the startups. And so it was very interesting to watch that juxtaposition. The way the deliberate innovation approach works is that the tools and the principles are applicable no matter whether you're a small company that's just getting off the ground or you're a big company trying to tackle the realities of a new world and a changing customer profile. How do you build innovative products and innovative ideas for your company doesn't really, like the ideas stay and the principles stay the same, but the application and the scale of it sort of change depending upon your situation. So what we found is that the startups learn a lot from the corporations about how they're structured and how their innovation processes are structured and how they can interact with one another to a certain extent. And the corporations in turn learn from the startup founders what kind of like an agile environment that they have and how their ability to move quickly helps them move faster, and how can they borrow some of those principles or some of those structures for their own team within the larger organization so that they can maybe adapt and use those things to their own benefit.
If you want to understand more about the science behind customer decisions, follow our blog at blog.worthix.com or find Worthix on your favorite social media. Getting your CX project off the ground? Start with the right foot by downloading our CX guides, ebooks, and playbooks on worthix.com today.
Yeah, Nami, as you think about this process and the work you're doing at CDI, and we wanted to talk to you as well about behavioral economics and how this kind of, factors in and weaves in. Could you talk a little bit about behavioral economics and maybe two things? One, just to level set, because when people start talking about behavioral economics, all sorts of different things come to mind. And I think like a lot of different terms, people have a different perspective on what it means. So from your context and the work that you've done, how you define it, and then how that weaves into the work that you're doing and applies to the process that you're going through.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting question that you ask. And let me just say to everybody who's listening, I am by no means even at an apprentice level at trying to get my head around psychology and behavioral economics and all this whole new field that I've just starting to learn about. But like I said, the fact that I went through grad school at least gave me the tools of trying to figure out how I can go about this in a systematic way. And that's where I am in the process. The props go to Dr. Merrick First at Georgia Tech. He's a distinguished professor in the College of Computing, and he started the center with this vision in 2011 of trying to figure out, is there a way to engineer a process for innovation that startups could use almost in A, B, C equals success kind of a way. That was at the outset. Could we even do anything to improve the odds for a startup? And what in the 7-8 years of running the programs and doing the work at the center, what the team has come to realize is that the common wisdom that is given to almost all entrepreneurs is to get out of the office and get in front of customers. And they're asked to build a product depending upon what they think their customers need, to try to get in front of the customers, to try and sell it to them. Well, it doesn't work or they don't want to buy it. And then you come back, go to the drawing board and try and figure out, okay, what should I change now so that based on what I heard from the customer so that they will want to buy it. And then you make that and then go back to the customer and sort of go over this loop multiple times till you maybe hit the magic secret or you completely miss and have to close down the startup. And what the common thing that we found is like, why do you go over this loop over and over again? What if you stopped yourself from building a product before you were certain that what you were building actually had a value that the consumer wanted to purchase or knew for certain that the consumer.
Starting with a minimum viable product, is that it?
So we
the
actually
concept of starting off with something small.
Right. So we actually don't talk in terms of minimum viable products because we think that it puts too much of the emphasis on what the product needs to be. Mm-hmm. And the whole focus of the deliberate innovation approach is to see people for who they are. Mm-hmm. And that I think is the more fascinating part of the approach is you don't build anything till you understand the situation that the customer is in and what it is that they're actually not indifferent to that you could create then, and then that would change their lives. So let me give you an example. When people say, oh, make something that your customer wants, like if you stop right there and think about it, aren't there things in your life that you want that you never buy?
Mm-hmm. Or the opposite, things that you don't even know you need, right?
Yeah, but if you just hold yourself right there of like, if you made a product that your consumer wanted, mm-hmm. but it fell into the category of I want this, but I'm not going to buy it, or you can never build a scalable company off of that idea of just making something that people want. Now, the same applies to like, desire, and what we've seen is that those words, want, like, desire, are just not safe and reliable from an innovation standpoint to be able to build something around that and expect your customer to consistently buy whatever it is that you make for them.
So you need to find. And so, is that it? Is that the verb you're looking
for? It's not even need. What we've realized is that none of these verbs actually capture what it is that you want from your customer. What you're looking for is, in fact, non-indifference.
Huh.
You want them to think in terms of, or you want the entrepreneur to think in terms of, what is it that my customer is going to be non-indifferent to, that if I make it, they're going to reach for immediately. And so the language and the approach is geared towards thinking in terms of what is a non-indifference. And so we've come up with like thinking of customers in a different way, is what can you make for them that they cannot not buy, or they cannot not avoid doing. So it's this like not principle, that double negative, that double not is actually important because it's a frame of thinking. It's a logical way of thinking in which you can actually understand what it is that makes the customer who they are and makes them become more of themselves. And what we've realized is that thinking of it in this like negative framework actually helps, because if I ask you what is the opposite of up, what would you say?
Down.
Not up. Not
okay,
up.
but yeah, there you go. James has that. It's not up. There's so many different directions that your customer can go in that is not up.
Sure.
And so when you think in that binary way that we're used to, that the opposite of up is down, and you have to shift from that framework to thinking of the opposite of up is not up. And the same thing for opposite of white is not white. It's not just black. There's so many other colors you could choose from.
Right.
So the minute you think about it that way, then you can think about your customer as, there's so many things that they could do, they should do, they would do, but there are certain set of things that they cannot not do.
No, it's fascinating, and this we've heard this once before, Mary, in the podcast series. Every time I hear this idea of indifference, traditionally when we think about indifference, it doesn't typically connect with action, right? Mm-hmm. Indifference, typically, we're used to hearing indifference being very neutral. I'm indifferent, so there's no action. It feels like a very passive,
nonchalant, right?
Area. Right, like. So it fascinates me that this is sort of the terminology that we use to actually, we're saying that this is the way to get to action.
So that's what you want to identify, right? Like what are the situations in which your customer is going to be passive or non-indifferent to the fact that indifferent to the fact that you showed up with a product that could change their lives. Well, if they're indifferent, they're not going to act in any way, shape, or form. How is that helpful to the entrepreneur or innovator? So you want to look for the opposite of that indifference, which we call non-indifference.
Yeah.
So you want the opposite, that inaction and that passiveness. Right. That's what is going to move them towards wanting your.
Gotcha.
That's great. I mean, and this is all behavior, right? This is all psychology. It's all understanding what motivates people to buy and not to buy. It's about the decisions, about cost benefit. All of these issues are kind of intertwined with this concept, aren't they?
Absolutely. It's at the end of the day, I think when startups talk about, oh, my customer is a big business like Porsche, and I'm a B2B entrepreneur. When you define it that way, you kind of lose the granularity of actually taking the time to understand, well, Porsche as a company is not going to buy what you're making. There's one person within that large organization who is responsible, or to whom what you're making is going to be something of a non-indifference in their life. And that's why they are going to buy it. So even that view of thinking of like organizations as like acting on their own, that's not really what's going on. There are people within those organizations, your customers, if you're selling B2C, there are those individuals who are going to make those choices and whose lives you want to be making better by doing something helping them do something that they cannot not do. And so trying to see the customer for who they are, where they are, and how they are, that's the whole point of the approach.
Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix. If you're interested in customer experience, behavior economics, or data science, follow Worthix on social media or subscribe to our blog for the best content on the web. That's amazing. And I think that's one thing that it's not a new concept. It's been around for quite some time, and we've got several brilliant minds along the last maybe 3 decades that have been discussing this topic, but it's front and center right now. I think the importance of understanding human behavior has once again become extremely relevant to companies of all sizes, regardless of being a startup or an enterprise. Are there some strong actionables of ways that the CDI and your work have been helping companies, Atlanta-based companies and maybe even companies from around the country as well?
Sure. So when the work first started, what happened was more or less we'd see how innovators, whether in large companies or at startups, would go out into the field and want to do customer interviews. That's one of the common wisdoms that goes around, like go out and talk to your customers and do interviews. But it's well established in psychology that interviews don't actually work. There's so much sense making that happens in interviews that it just does not work. You're interpreting the way your customer is reacting to something in the way that makes sense to you. There's so many there's so many
biases,
cognitive biases, exactly, that are getting in the way of you seeing and understanding what it is that they're actually trying to tell you. And so what we realize is that it's these cognitive biases, especially things like confirmation bias, where your customer tells you a list of 10 things that they're working on, or that's top of mind for them, and you listen to point number 8 and point number 9, and that's what your startup is trying to solve, and you're like, fantastic, that's exactly what I want to do, and you forget the fact that there were 7 other items that they mentioned before they ever got to anything that you were interested in working on. And so that's just one of the ways in which confirmation bias shows up. The other ways are like they double down on anything that, the entrepreneur or innovator doubles down on anything that is non-confirmational, that is contradictory to the way they view their world. There are other artifacts like demand characteristics that show up when you go out to interview customers. So the way demand characteristics show up is when you go out and you ask questions in a way that indicates to the other person what is the answer that you're looking for, and that's the answer they give you. So an example would be, here's a product that I spent the last 7 months of my life building. I poured my savings down into this. Would you buy it?
Yeah, we get that all the time in customer experience where people are like, can you give me a 10? Because if you don't give me a 10, then I'm not going to get my bonus, and then I'm going to lose my house, and I don't know what. So please give me a 10. We're like, come on, it's cheating.
Yes, absolutely. So you're like indicating, that's one very obvious way of indicating to whoever you're talking with what the answer is that you are expecting, right? And those kinds of demand characteristics show up in a lot of different subtler ways as well. And we're just not paying attention. Like there's only so much that the human mind can pay attention to at some point. And when you go out and do these interviews, you really have to pick and choose how you structure those conversations so that demand characteristics, cognitive biases, all of these other artifacts are minimized. You can never get rid of all of them, but the effects of them, being aware of how they manifest, being aware of how you bring up demand characteristics in your questions, all of that helps you come up with a plan of like, okay, how am I going to design a process that will help me mitigate the effects of all of these things.
Yeah.
So that's one of the very actionable items that the center helps entrepreneurs and innovators build a process around.
So the solution, if it's not interviewing, what's the solution? What's the alternative?
The solution that we found is that we built this process called a documented primary interaction. And so it's called a DPI for short. And so the 3 letters have significance. So the first part, the word documented, means that every interaction gets recorded in one way, shape, or form, whether it is by video or by audio. And then there's usually 2 people who we ask to go to a DPI with. And the second person, one person is designated as the lead on the DPI, and the second person is designated as an observer, so that they also take notes on the actual interaction sometimes. So those are the different ways in which it's documented. Then the primary part means you hold the person that you're talking to give you insights about their behavior. So there's no reporting on somebody else's behavior or feelings or insights. So if you're talking to one person, they can only talk about what their experience is, what their ability to lead their lives looks like. They can't report on somebody else's ability or job function, for instance. So that's the primary part of the DPI. And the last part talks about it being an interaction. So much like the conversation we're having right now, it is a conversation. There's no pre-scripted questions that you go into a DPI with, because you want to be able to take the conversation where the customer wants to take it, not guide it the way you want it to go, because then you're not listening to what they're saying. You're not listening to, how they want to say it. You just already have an agenda, and that's all you're trying to fill.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely.
So that's a process that we built to combat the fact that interviews don't actually work.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more with the last point. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with Worthix, but the way we've designed our approach is very much around several of those points about not pre-scripting questions, about allowing them to dialogue about their experience rather than trying to construct some rigid attribute-led list of things that we're trying to measure. So it's interesting to hear.
Yeah.
I also wondered whether in your travels, Nami, have you been helping companies to sort of elevate what they're doing around customer service beyond the measurement side? Because we've talked a little bit now in the last couple of questions about measurement, but are you also getting involved with companies in trying to think about how to apply behavioral economics to the way they approach the business in general, the way they think about how they engage with consumers? And do you have any examples of things that you've worked on that you could share with the audience around something that you've been excited about, or even something maybe that you didn't work on, but you saw the application of in the real world to a business problem, and how behavioral economics was able to help bring some insight to that?
So I'm not sure if I have experiences that actually speak to that, but let me say something, and feel free to interrupt me if this is not what you're looking for.
Okay.
So one of the things that we see in the program and at the center is that innovators come in with the product idea already, and they're like, now tell me, how do I build this? How do I fund this? And I was reading this brilliant piece from the Harvard Business Review. It's I think the title of the piece is Marketing Myopia, and it talks about how large companies orient themselves toward a product and then lose sight of the customer. So, for instance, think of the railroad companies that were so big and so ubiquitous and central to the economy, and they defined themselves as railroad companies and forgot very quickly that they were not a railroad company, but instead they were in the business of transportation. They were in the business of enabling their customers move from point A to point B. And that's what made them come into existence and thrive. So when you don't define yourself in the context of what it is you're doing for your customer, and instead look at it from a product perspective, what happens is what happened with the railroad. The minute they define themselves as railroad companies, when the buses and the cars and all the other modes of transport, airplanes started coming in, because you think of yourself as a railroad company, you don't think you can branch out into other modes of transportation that still facilitate and do for your customer what you were doing. You don't move with the different changes in the society in terms of technology, in terms of what can be done. You stay boxed in as sort of this railroad company, instead of saying, well, I'm not in the railroad business now, I'm in the transportation business, which means that I can help facilitate my customers moving from point A to point B in various modes, not just in the railroad. So that's one way I've seen like the myopia of thinking of what your business is in terms of your product takes you away from what it is you're actually doing for your customer, what non-indifference it is that you're solving for your customer. And that makes you lose sight of what you can do to continuously be innovative.
That's a great story. I often, over the years, I've worked with a lot of different companies, and many will be engineering led, where they sort of develop capability and then they figure out sort of a consumer application of the tech. And then you work with other companies that come at it from a completely different angle around consumer need and what people are looking for. I mean, one of the most famous examples I often talk about is BlackBerry. Right? They were an engineering led business where they had all this tech. They were pushing it out, while Apple sort of came at it more from the consumer side. And history has shown sort of what happened in those examples. And this is why I'm fascinated by your experience as well, Nami, where you bring together different pieces. I mean, you have this degree in engineering as well as this side in design, and bringing these two things together. I think as we continue this journey together on planet Earth, I think bringing those things together becomes more and more important in how we view how to engage with consumers.
I agree with that, James. Just from my experience, what I've seen is that a lot of the times you are so close to the product, the company, that you don't actually see, or you don't have the luxury of seeing how it looks like to other people. And I think that the work that I do over here at the center, what I did at the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute, was to help facilitate or be that third person observer who can come in and say, well, you've been eating, breathing, sleeping this startup, this product, this innovation for the last X number of months. And you can't expect to show it to other people and enable them and assume that they will understand it at the level that you have a familiarity with and understand it. You need to put in the effort and the time that it takes to be able to craft that kind of story, to craft that message and that conversation or that interaction, so that they can understand where you're coming from. And more to the point, you understand where it is that their lives are and how can you be meaningful to them in turn.
Yeah, Nami, it's interesting because when I read your bio and I saw that the things that you've dedicated your life to studying. You have data analytics, right? You're an engineer. There's statistics in there. Now you're doing behavior psychology and behavior economics. There's design. There's innovation. To me, it sounds a lot like what the description of this podcast is as well. So yeah, I feel like you're the perfect guest. And the one thing that I wanted to hear, because you really are tying in all these elements with your approach and with what you're doing, what would be your one recommendation, taking all these aspects into consideration, for a company, whether they're a startup or whether they are a big enterprise? What is the most important thing to keep in mind regarding customer experience? It's a tough one, I know.
Oh my God. I think the way I think about it is, just the way you describe all the pieces of experience I have right now. On all of those levels, I would never describe myself as an expert on all of those. Mm-hmm. I have some competencies on some, and I'm learning the other parts. And it's sort of crazy to expect everybody to be like that. And the one thing that I've learned is the nature of the way in which cognitive biases and these blind spots and the ways in which all of these other phenomena manifest is so hard for human beings to notice just on the fly, right? Like even with data analysis, if you go in trying to look for one thing, you will only find that thing and you'll ignore all the other stuff that you could have found were you open to that. And I think that what I've found is you actually need a process that protects you from that sort of short-sighted or like that focus. It's great to have that focus when you know what you're solving. And it's like my advisor told me when I was doing my Ph.D. He said, 50% of the battle is won once you formulate the right question. So I think that you need a process that protects you from yourself while you're going about that.
Because we're blind to our own biases, right? That's the essence of what bias is.
Exactly. So you need a process that protects you from that. And, in different places, it shows up in different ways. The deliberate innovation approach is the way I've seen it come up, like in a consistent way that innovators and just about anybody could try to apply it. And let me just give you like a layman's example. So for instance, we know for a fact that human beings cannot measure accurately with their eyes, right? So if you go into a woodworking shop and you say the culture with which we operate over here is one where we measure twice and cut once, which is why we have signs everywhere that say, measure twice, cut once. We make rulers available, and everybody who comes into this place operates in that way. And then when I see Mary or James cutting a piece out without measuring it, I can tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, can you measure twice before you cut it out? So we know that we're being accurate. That's how the process and the culture and the environment can protect against things that we can't see for ourselves, because that's just how we're wired.
Yeah.
That's the limitation of the instrument itself, going back to what I said earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you were able to summarize a lot of concepts that I have all spread out in my mind. So I'm really grateful for that, because it's absolutely true. The only way to fight the biases that we are blind to is by creating processes that, like you said, they won't get rid of the biases, but they'll at least try to keep them at a minimum. Right. And we all we can do, and one of the things we say here at the center is we can just try to be less strong every time we do something. That's awesome. Nami, thank you so much. If our listeners want to keep in touch with you or continue listening to your message, or can you help us with some way to find you or have people contact you? If that's what you want, of course. I have all these random people. Part of what we're doing, the work that we're doing at the center, is to help make the deliberate innovation approach accessible, and it's coming up in different ways. We are in the website for the center is cdi.gatech.edu. I can be reached by email, and I think, Mary, you can provide that somewhere in the description so that people can feel free to please reach me by email. Dr. Merrick First is the person who pioneered this approach, and I can share his email with you as well, Mary, to include in the details. We'd love to hear from the viewers, and if there's any way we can be meaningful to the work that you're doing, we'd absolutely love to partner on that.
Awesome.
That's just great. Well, thank you so much. James, thank you so much for being here today and contributing with your experience and insight.
Yeah, thanks, Nami, and thanks, Mary. It's really interesting.
Thank you both for having me today.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Customer Experience. If you'd like to hear more or get a full podcast summary, visit the episode details page or go to blog.worthix.com/podcasts. This episode of Voices of Customer Experience was hosted and produced by Mary Drumond, co-hosted by James Conrad, and edited by Nick Gomez. Blog copy and summary by Emma Waldron.